Hello, in this video we're going to go over classes in Python. Classes are also known as objects. They're what make Python an object-oriented programming language. Object-oriented programming is a programming paradigm that's based on the concept of objects, which these objects can contain data, which may be in the form of fields or variables, also often known as attributes. These objects could also hold code in the form of procedures, or also known as functions or methods. And this will make more sense as we go through the code. Classes can be made in separate files as well, and those classes can be called from other programs. But for the sake of this tutorial, we're going to do it all in just one file. So let's go ahead and get started. And in this program, we're going to be modeling a you'll have instructors, students, and classes. And so a class will have students as well as an instructor assigned to it. So first, let's make an instructor class. So class instructor. So the way we define a class is we do class and then the name of it, instructor. And then you need to initialize a class or an object. And the way you do that is create a function within the class. And so and you always do it with the init function. And self is a reference to itself. And so it's what you use when you're initializing. So you'll do a set. So for an instructor, we'll need a name and an ID for the instructor. So we'll do set name to an empty string. And so this is when you create this instructor object, when you call it from code, you have to initialize it. And so this is what will happen when you create this object. So it'll create a name that's blank and an ID that's blank. And the way you do that is you have to do self dot name equals, and then we'll set it there, empty. Now we could automatically set this to a name, or we could automatically set the ID to something if we wanted to. But for this sake, we're just going to set it to empty. But this allows it to know that, hey, we have these attributes, name and ID. Alright. So then we'll want to, after we create the instructor object, we'll also want to be able to get the instructor's information easily. We'll be able to get each individual name and ID, but what if we want to grab the name and ID at the same time? So one way to do this is create a function within the object. We can say instructor info, and we'll say we'll define a get info. You always have to pass self when you're in these classes. That way you can set these variables later on. So we'll do a return dictionary of, or if you want to access those variables as well, you can either set or access them, of instructor info. Return. And so when we call this, we're going to return a dictionary back to the part of code that is calling it. So do self.name and then ID. Let's self.id. So this will allow the user to manipulate the data however they want by returning a dictionary, but at least gives both the name and the ID back with one call. This will be useful when we get to our student and our class objects, as they'll have more than just name and ID. Alright, so we've created the instructor object, so let's go ahead and create a student object. So let's do class student. Let's say class, just name it student. We need to initialize the class. Let's say we'll define our initial self. Say set name to empty string, because we also student will have a name. Student will also have an ID similar to the instructor, but we'll also want to know your graduation year. Something you usually want to know of a student. And instead of a string, we'll set that to a 0, which is a number, because a year is a number. And we'll do a get info for this as well. So we'll get student info. It'll be very similar to the get info instructor. So return dictionary name, self.name, ID, self.id, and grad year, self.grad year. Alright, so that's our student class or object. Now we'll create our class or course object. So class for class. Class. It seems kind of funny, but I'm going to name it class. So it's a class. We'll initialize class. And again, we need to do the define init, because we're doing that. Oh, and I just noticed it's typed up there. Alright. So now we'll have a name, an ID, and then we'll want to know which instructor is tied to each class, as well as what students are in each class. So this is how it'll be a little bit different from the instructor and student class. So we'll set name to empty string, just like before. And equals. ID to empty string, self.id equals. And now we'll do the instructor. So we're actually going to initialize an instructor object. So as we're going to name it self.instructor, and it's going to actually call the instructor class. So it's going to initialize, it's going to create an instructor object when you create a class. So that way we know that it is of instructor type, and you can access the instructor's information through the class. And we're going to do something similar for the student, but we're actually just going to create, since there's going to be multiple students in a class, we'll actually just create a list, and then later we can add student objects to the list. So we can do create an empty list to store students in. So students equals and I guess I didn't explain this very well. So this is just how you call the instructor class that's above you, because we're not passing anything to it. We're just saying, hey, create a new instructor object. And so if you were to access this object, it would just have a blank name and blank ID, because that's what we initialize it to up here. And shortly we'll show how you set the name and ID when you create one. So, alright, so it's student. So now we need to, just like before, we want to get, so if we have a class object, we might want to know all the students that are in the class, or all the information of the instructor, if we only know what the class is. So we'll be calling the get infos from this class through another function. So we'll do get student students of class, and we'll define get students. We'll create an empty dictionary to store the student values in. And then we'll want to loop over that list that we have within the object. So we'll do for each student in the new students list, we'll add student to the dictionary, because we want to present it back to the user as a dictionary, so that we're uniform across everything, as well as dictionaries are nice to present back data with their key value pairs. So the way we'll add that is student values. Set our student.id as the key, and then we'll say student.getInfo is the rest of the dictionary. So we're using a function from another class inside a function from another class. So the getStudents function of the object class is calling the getInfo function of the student class. Right. And then we will return the dictionary of students. So return student. values. Alright. As well as we want to do the same thing for the instructor. It's a little easier for that one because we don't have a list of instructors, we just have the one. So we'll get instructor for class. We'll say define get instructor self return self dot instructor dot get info. So this is the instructor. As you can see, it's referencing the instructor of the class, and it's calling the get info of this object that it created, and that we created in the instructor class. Alright, so we've created 3 classes or objects. We've created the instructor class and object, we have name ID, and we created a function to be able to get that info at one time instead of it being each individual. And we did the same thing for student. The only difference there is there's a grad year. And then for the class, it was the same thing. There's an ID for the class and a name. But we also have an instructor for each class and then a list of students for each class. And we created functions that we can return all of them when needed. So let's go ahead and actually create objects and access them. Because these are just think of these as like the blueprints of the objects, and then we're actually going to create the objects now. So we'll start with instructor. Create instructor object. I'll do instructor 1 because we're going to have multiple instructors because we're going to have multiple classes, and we're just going to create a new instructor. Alright, and let's set the instructor name. So instructor1 dot name, and notice how PyCharm will auto complete that for you. So it knows that you have a name and an ID, and it even knows that you can access get info because instructor1 is a instructor object. So let's to the name, and we're going to say the instructor's name is Severus Snape. And we'll do a set instructor ID. It's very similar to what we did for the name. And we're just going to say the instructor ID is I-1. Alright. So now we'll create 2 more of these, and I will be lazy and copy this because I know that it's going to be very similar. The only thing we will change is the values and the variable names. Instructor 2, instructor 2, instructor 2. This instructor 2 will be Rubius Hagrid, and his ID will be I-2. This instructor will be instructor 3. This instructor's name will be Rumius. And it'll be I-3. Alright. So we've created 3 instructors. We've set their names and their IDs. Now we'll set the students, or create students. We'll create 3 students as well. Now the students can be in multiple classes. So that'll be something to think about as we're doing this. So let's create a student object. So student1 equals student, and set student name, student1.name equals long bomb. Set student ID, student1 ID equals, we'll do s-1. Alright, let's set their grad year. Set student grad year. Set student1 dot grad year is equal to it's a number 2034. Alright, so now that we've done that, I've created one, and the next two are going to be very similar. We'll copy that, paste that. Some people say, well, why aren't you typing it out? It might be good practice to type it out. I'm not going to disagree with that. But for the sake of time, I'm going to copying and pasting these. And you've done it once. Sometimes it's easier to just copy and paste, and you don't get fatigued of just typing the same thing over and over again. But you do make mistakes like this with copying and pasting. So things you have to watch out for and be meticulous about when you copy and paste. Alright. So our second student's name will be Ron Weasley. And his grad year will be 2033. Alright. And our third student will be Draco Malfoy. S3, and he'll be a 2034 grad as well. Alright. So now that we have our instructors and our students, we can create our classes. So to do that, it's very similar to our process that we've been doing. So we'll create a class object. We'll say class1 equals the class object. So we'll create a new class object. We're going to set the class ID. So class1 dot ID is equal to we'll say CS dash 1. And we'll set the class name, class1 dot name equals CS, not CS. We'll say intro to Python. And then we'll set the class instructor, and class1 dot instructor. And so since we know instructors and objects, an instructor object, we can say, all right, well, we're going to set it to an instructor object. Well, we've created instructor objects already. Remember, we created 3. We have instructor 1, instructor 2, and instructor 3. So we'll set this to instructor 1, which is also, I believe, Severus Snape. And then let's students to the class. Students, not students. Students to the class. We do this by accessing the list. So class 1 students, just like we append to a list. And we'll say, alright, well, student 1, and let's add another one. Students append students 2. Alright, so we've created our first class. We added instructors and students to it. We can create 2 more classes here. And we'll say 2 and we'll give it a CS ID of CS-2, and we'll say we're doing intro to C. And our class 2 will be set to instructor 2, which I believe is Mr. Hagrid, and student 3 and student 2. So student 2 will be in both of those classes. Class 3. And give it an ID of CS-3. We'll say intro to Java. And the third instructor, which I believe is Lupin. And how about just one student? We'll say student 3. Alright. So, we have created 3 instructors, 3 students, 3 classes, or courses. So now, let's print these out and see how we did, and kind of wrap it up to kind of see, okay, this is what we've been working towards. Now, you wouldn't necessarily just do this just to print them out. You'd probably be using this on the back end of a program to be able to move data around, or maybe you're creating users and you're storing the objects, you're storing the user's information in an object first before putting it into a database, or you're creating objects to pass messages along to other programs. Many cases for this, but this is just to kind of demonstrate how classes work. So let's print these out. So we'll do print class ID and name. So print class 1.id, class 1.name. Show class instructor info. Print instructor class 1.get instructor. And we'll do list students in class. So print students. So class 1 dot get students. So this is where our functions that we created in our classes will come into play, so that we don't have to call each of them. We can, instead of sitting here going, all right, and if you give me instructor.id, instructor.name, we can say, oh, just get instructor, and it'll get both of those for us, as well as the student Alright, again, copy and paste this, and all I have to do is change the class. And we should be able to run this and see our final output from all of that hard work. Alright, so we have class 1, class 2, and class 3. Alright, so let's go ahead and run this. Oh, got an error. Alright, class 1.getInstructor. No match for getInstructor. Interesting. That's because it's not get. Oh, I see what I did here. This is where the indentation comes into play. I should have noticed it when it didn't auto-complete that for me. So it was stuck under, I thought it was part of the initialization. So now, if we run it, it should be fine. Let me make sure these are all good. That's one of the downsides to Python is the indentation, whereas other languages you can use brackets and braces to know where code should be executing. So let's run this again, and we have output. So CS-1, intro to Python. Our instructor is Severus Snape, and his ID is I1. Students on the course, so S1 is Neville Longbottom, grad year 2034. Ron Weasley is S2, and his grad year is 2033. CS2 Intro to SQL, our instructor is Rubius I spelled Hagrid wrong there. Hagrid, I guess. Students, Draco Malfoy and Ron Weasley. An Intro to Java, instructor, Rumius, Draco. And if you want to make this neater, you could always just call the student name here. But for the sake of time, I just called the whole, just printed out the whole dictionary. So I hope this gave a little help and crash course in objects and classes. Again, you need to initialize, and then you don't have to have a function to access these. You can just do the initialization and then set the name and ID later. But these just kind of help to be able to get information later. So I hope you enjoyed this, and have a great day.